Hello, Donald. Can you hear me?
Good evening.
All righty. Well, everything is rolling here. Our equipment's working fine. Let me introduce you. We are speaking this evening with a venerable researcher, Donald Freed, who, along with Raymond Biggs, is the co-author of the book Killing Time, Who Murdered Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, the first full investigation, published in hardcover by Macmillan Books. Donald, I want to thank you thank you for your work over the years. I want to welcome you to our airwaves. For me, this is an exciting interview because when I began doing this research many years ago, among the many sources of inspiration for my work was your work. Way back in the 1970s, I was reading some of the fantastic material that you've been involved in authoring, and it's been my pleasure and privilege to access some of that to my audience. So once again, welcome to our airwaves, and thanks for your work.
Well, thank you, because I, in turn, have been listening to your sort of national radio dialogue for some time, and then comparing notes with others who listen.
All righty. Well, this is it's sort of like Old Home Week in a sense.
Right.
Now, you have authored a book. This evening we're going to be talking about the O.J. Simpson case. That's something that has occupied an awful lot of media attention, but sadly has not received the attention due it in a lot of important respects. And you, along with Raymond Briggs, a Ph.D., have co-authored a book which sets forth a great many aspects of the O.J. Simpson case that the public has not been told about. And you include, among other things, a detailed analysis of the timeline. We're going to have a chance to touch on that. I thought, Donald, by way of initiating the discussion on your book, that I would read from page 17. There are a couple of paragraphs in which I think you sum up the not only thesis statement of your book, but some of the dilemmas that have faced investigators, including the prosecution. Reading now from page 17 of Killing Time, the first full investigation by Donald Freed and Raymond Briggs, Ph.D. The prosecution's overarching theme and thesis of the crime is homicidal jealousy, beginning with the smoldering rage of the defendant at young Sidney Simpson's dance recital. This scenario includes many of the critical items that would be discussed during the trial: a knife, leather gloves, a dark knit hat, a white Ford Bronco, Bruno Marley shoes, bloody socks, an air conditioner, and a waiting limousine and driver. However, you will note as we proceed that virtually every phrase in this first draft of the prosecution's case would be amended and in some cases deleted. In fact, nearly every assertion of the prosecution, from blood chemistry to the psychology of obsessive jealousy to the philosophy of gender conflict to the farewell note and, quote, slow speed chase, unquote, there would be a profound ambivalence, contradiction, overdetermination, and confusion of conflicting elements, quote, doubleness, unquote, some pointing to guilt, some to innocence, and as we shall see, some to both. The two major bases for the prosecution's case, the jealousy abuse motive and the trail of blood from the Bundy to the Rockingham residence, require separate, in-depth discussion, and the place for that is Chapter 2, and we're going to touch on that in a second. At this point in time, it is the prosecution's storyline that must be accepted by the jury in order to find the defendant guilty. We must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that O.J. Simpson is guilty of the double murder. One of the things that you and your co-author do is to posit the reader basically as the jury. Now, in alluding to the doubleness, Donald, you and your co-author discuss an ambivalence with regard to the prosecution's assessment of O.J. Simpson's motives for allegedly committing these crimes. On the one hand, smoldering rage, an out-of-control, jealous husband, almost an Othello type, and on the other hand, a coolly calculating, cold-blooded killer, so totally in possession of himself that he was able to befuddle all investigators by disposing of the bloody clothes and the murder weapon, despite the fact that he dropped 2 gloves and a cap at the scene where he supposedly committed the murders. Could you develop that ambivalence for us further?
This term, doubleness, David, as you know, we take from W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American sociologist, when he wrote in 1903 in a classic book called The Soul of Black Folks. And we might look at that quote a little later on. But doubleness hangs over Mr. Simpson and the other principals in the drama and over the crime. over the police, over a whole culture, indeed, divided by race and other contradictions. And so a crime or an event which began as a kind of tabloid circus, a canvas of sensation and toxic media, chemistry, stirring the various themes and characters together, it began to take on meaning, and then to hemorrhage meaning, and then from going from having no meaning to too much meaning, and then filling up the country. And now, in the last year, since the verdict of not guilty, the white educated class has unleashed a torrent of race and rage in their fury at Simpson receiving a not guilty verdict. So that's the context. That's the atmosphere in which this all takes place. And unfortunately, in your program being an exception, the so-called progressive or active organs of the left and magazines and radio and so on, it appears to be too vulgar, too dangerous an event for serious analysis. But I think that in a democracy we have to take these events as they come, and you have to grapple with them, especially when they have the power, because of their very vulgarity, to electrify the population. And having just returned from several weeks basically talking to African-American newspapers and African-American radio networks and stations, as well as a few ordinary white or mainstream stations or television, I can report to you that there is a depth of despair and danger in the country, organized along lines of race, such has not been seen in a long, long time. And because it is subterranean, and because the very spokesman who in the past had operated as kind of vanguard for explaining black America to white America, that is the educated class and the media class, it is that class precisely which has chosen to blame African-American jurors, defendant, and lawyers for, as they say, playing the race card and thus causing a crisis in American justice and American race relations. And this began at the very beginning with the blackening of Mr. Simpson's photograph on the cover of Time magazine.
You mentioned in your book, you not only talk about the deliberate darkening of O.J. Simpson's image, but compare it to an earlier piece of photographic journalistic calumny, perhaps we could say, in which another Time Life product, in this case Life magazine, helped to set up Lee Harvey Oswald as the patsy for President Kennedy's assassination.
Well put. This is a process of demonization, which is so blatant and so vulgar that the perpetrators are caught, makes you stop, and like the clock striking 13, it makes you question every other facet or snapshot that you think you know about a given event. And so, David, and you're particularly equipped to carry on this conversation, the Simpson affair could be discussed in propaganda terms alone if one wanted to. One could set aside the entire forensics of the case and discuss it as nothing but propaganda and race. And it perhaps deserves that at some other time. I think, though, that we owe it, because there's been so much of this propaganda, we owe it to ourselves to go over some of the actual facts on the ground of the case.
Now, one of the things that, referring again to the doubleness, on the one hand, O.J. Simpson as an out-of-control, impassioned, at least temporary psychopath, or the image that's been presented, and then on the other hand, a cool, cunning master criminal able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, as Superman was supposed to have been able to do, and do things that nobody could really do. One of the things that was used by the prosecution as well as the media to demonize O.J. Simpson was to discuss his past history of domestic abuse. Now, this is not in any size, shape, form, or manner to excuse domestic abuse or violence by men against women, or what O.J. Simpson on one occasion at least did to Nicole. One of the things you point out in your book, though, is that the handling, both by the media and the prosecution, of the domestic abuse issue was less than objective. Could you tell us about that?
I think so, and I think it's wise of you to bring it up first, because it is that element which prejudiced so many people. Once the district attorney leaked the 911 tape, and it was played on radio, and leaked a whole series of abuse charges and testimony. It's a very delicate issue. It's not good enough to say abuse is terrible, but it isn't murder. Abuse is terrible, but if he didn't do it, so what? You have an emotional connotation to these charges that has to be faced. I would say this to listeners who are serious about both the case and or propaganda, or both. Take a look at Simpson's depositions. Take a look at how he talks about his relationship. This was a 17-year relationship. It certainly was volatile. And take a look at the interplay of the personalities involved, and the divorce, and come to your own conclusion with your own knowledge of life as to whether it is within or without the parameters of a volatile relationship. Now, you may remember that the prosecution based its entire case on this motive of abuse, but they called no expert, not one. And you may remember that the defense had the leading expert in this matter interview Simpson, and there was, whether she was going to testify for the defense that Simpson did not fit the profile or not, we will never know, because I'd like to mention in passing that Detective Furman not only ruined the case for the prosecution, but for the defense as well, by giving them a cheap and quick and sensational victory, which convinced the jury, but which confused the country. And the defense had a large forensic case further to put on, as well as Simpson in person, to testify. Now, this matter of abuse and this matter of violence between people in general and between men and women and couples in particular, it does no good to make emblematic a case that has been stereotyped. I mean by that, it can be, and it may be in this case, that there is an equal volatility between the partners, but an unequal physical strength. And that alone is the determining factor, I would suggest, in the existential situation in these matters. That these are not necessarily moral or ethical or gender issues. Men and women may be equally more or less destructive towards themselves and towards each other, but what determines, as in all other cases where power is unequal, that then determines, it seems to me, the logic of behavior. So that in Simpson's case, we know, for instance, that in the 1989 911 call, to which he pled no contest, both what he said then, what he said now, and what he said since, and what Miss Simpson has said in some of her writings to him and letters to him at different times, seems to paint a picture of an emotional contest wherein his greater physical strength led to a situation which should have then been, shall we say, an inhibition or a taboo for any further relationship if they could not overcome this problem. And the 911 call that was played, referring to the 1993 encounter, we now know much more about that. And if you listen carefully to the background of that call, and you read the September issue of Esquire of this year, you will find out that it isn't just roaring and ranting on Simpson's part. He's making references there to, there are words, there are some names, the word hookers appears, there's a drug reference, a National Enquirer reference, and in the September Esquire, wherein Simpson is interviewed in a larger essay about the wealthy west side of Los Angeles, you find that the murders of Don Simpson, a wealthy producer, and his psychiatrist that were originally called overdoses and are now being investigated as homicides, that there are connections between these Don Simpson murders and the O.J. Simpson case. And so what sounds simply like a roaring rage has an actual content to it. Parenthetically, Simpson appears to have believed that Miss Simpson was talking to her mother on the telephone, not to the police. And that's why he's shouting into the phone so that his mother-in-law can hear his complaints about Nicole, and this is typical of their relationship, which was loud and which was verbal and vocal and included the whole family in its various arguments. I also remember Miss Simpson came down and made this call standing right in front of Simpson, and that later when the police came, some minutes later, they secretly tape-recorded a conversation between police and former husband and wife, and Miss Simpson did not want to press any charges. She then called Simpson the next day to apologize. I say all this only to show you that you cannot take anything for granted. You cannot, for instance, as in the Demoniak case, the so-called Ivan the Terrible, the man who was on death row in Israel for a number of years, and then in a spectacular moment, the High Court released him. But many in America who had followed the case grumbled, well, if he's not Ivan the Terrible, he's Ivan the less terrible. He did something else. That means you haven't learned anything. It's not good enough to say that Simpson is a notorious wife-beater, even if he didn't commit the murders. So therefore, we are not interested, or we can't afford to be bored, or to drop this case, because it has no heroes, no real villains, no angels, no demons, and so forth. After all, this is not a Saturday afternoon serial at the local Bijou or Fox. This is now a national issue, and to paraphrase Voltaire in talking about a trial of the century, of the 18th century, that whether Simpson be guilty or innocent, the nation is disgraced. There has to be a process now of dialogue beyond race and rage, and that's why we used computer timelines and a kind of forensic language for this book, Killing Time.
That reference, by the way, is, of course, to the Dreyfus case. At least one Bay Area author is writing an article, perhaps which may result in a book, comparing the two cases. A couple of points very quickly, Don, because there's so much in your book, and we have a great deal of information to try to at least touch on before the hour interview is over. With regard to domestic abuse, 2 points that you bring out. First of all, again, Nicole was supposedly, according to the prosecution and the media hype, living in constant terror of her husband, yet 3 weeks before she was murdered, she held a pizza party at Rockingham.
Oh, yes. There are many contradictions. She had been ill also that spring, and Simpson had been there bringing her food and nursing her. They had a complex relationship, and it has been badly stereotyped in order to lay the logic down for the prosecution's case. But as I say, they did not present one expert because the momentum wasn't there. The pattern wasn't there. And while it's true that men who murder their wives, the statistics show, also have abused them. But the reverse is not true. That is, men who abuse their wives do not murder them. Now, maybe that sounds unclear. If someone murders his wife, you will often find there's been a pattern of abuse and momentum leading to murder. Now, that's clear. But men who abuse their wives do not murder them.
As a rule.
As a rule, and when we say as a rule, we mean in the high percentiles. It's a very rare situation.
Before getting to some of the aspects of the physical evidence and the detailed, painstaking analysis that you and your co-author present, one of the points you make also, something that I did not realize until I read your book, was that Nicole testified at her divorce hearing that the 1989 incident was the only time O.J. Simpson hit her.
That is right. And the photographs and the rhetoric and the 911 calls and so on, the conflation of phenomenon surrounding the 1989 has been retailed in such a way as to give the public the impression that you had a sort of daily abuse going on.
Right.
But that is not the case.
One of the points that winds throughout your book concerns a timeline, and indeed this dominated the trial. The analysis that you and your co-author present is extremely detailed, and I think that it would be impossible to do justice to it in the context of a radio interview. I encourage members of the listening audience, by the way, to buy this book and to read this painstaking analyses, really, because you present various timelines. By 10:42, however, on the evening of Sunday, June 12, 1994, the prosecution had to admit that O.J. Simpson was home.
Yes, the prosecution's timeline is that at 10:03, Mr. Simpson called his friend Paula Barbieri on his cellular phone, was unable to reach her, and therefore went berserk. Committed the murders around 10:15, and then did or did not use the next 20 minutes or so to hide guilty clothes and weapon. But at any rate, by 10:42, had snuck home and had, by happenstance, banged into the wall of the guest house where Mr. Cato Kalin resided. At that time, according to the prosecution, Mr. Simpson dropped a bloody glove. He then staggered around to the front of the house and entered, and was seen by a young limousine driver who was waiting to take him to the airport. So the prosecution's murder clock closes down at about 10:42. And the reason we can be sure of that time is that there's Mr. Kalin, when he hears the knock on his wall, asks his friend on the telephone, "Did you hear an earthquake?" And he then hangs up, and that hang-up is computerized on his telephone log. Now, we use clocks, that one and a number of others, because there were telephone calls made by the various principals that night, again and again, and so you have an entire grammar of computerized anchored clocks. We also used, as you know, unofficial clocks, such as people walking dogs, and we used the restaurant time clock and time links on the credit card for people who were at the restaurant and later walked past the murder scene. And then at a further remove, we used melting ice cream and cooling bath water and such like clocks. But as Einstein said, anything which shows the passage of time is a clock. And there were many clocks, both official and unofficial, that night, and it's of those that we built the timeline. And, David, a common example of a timeline at this moment is the hapless Officer Jewell in Atlanta, the putative Olympic bomber who has been spared so far by his timeline.
There are a great many points that I want to touch on with regard to your book, Don. We're almost finished with the first half hour of the interview. I'd like to present some things almost in terms of bullet points, or perhaps knife points would be a better term under the circumstances, and ask you to do the impossible, like O.J. Simpson, only in an academic sense, and encapsulate as briefly and succinctly as possible some of the central information that you present in regard to this. Now, the prosecution's timeline, as we observed in the passage I read earlier, underwent a great many mutations. One of the things that they did was to toss out, or in some cases abuse, witnesses. And these were witnesses who thought O.J. was guilty because their information did not coincide with their timeline. I'm thinking of Robert Heidstra and Jill Shively.
Yeah, exactly, David. It's ironic that without exception, Simpson's alibi depends on ear witnesses who believed him guilty and could not understand why the prosecution abused them and did not use them as centerpieces in the prosecution case, and barely understand to this day how it is that their times arrived at in various ways, including telephone time logs, place the killing time is placed at 10:32 to 10:42 on that night, and that's over a dozen witnesses. Only one for the prosecution places it earlier at about 10:20. So, but the shouts, the screams, the calling, the voices, and the barking dog are heard between 10:32 and 10:42. But, of course, with 10:45 being the last sighting of a car racing away south in the opposite direction of the Simpson estate from the murder scene. And that prosecution timeline basically excludes Simpson from the crime because he cannot be home bumping into the wall and dropping the glove at the same time. However, with that in mind, we went one step far further and conducted what we called the Bronco experiment.
We're going to talk about that.
And we'll take that up a little later.
Yeah, because I want to go into that in a little bit more detail. But again, as briefly as possible, Robert Heidstra and Jill Shively, a couple of the witnesses who felt O.J. was guilty, but whose information was thrown out by the prosecution.
That's right. One sees what could be a white Bronco speeding away at 10:45, and Shively sees a man at 10:50, which she first thinks is Marcus Allen, but later decides was O.J. Simpson. But in any case, those times are too late.
And Robert Heidstra also was actually humiliated by the prosecution.
He was indeed. The various working-class witnesses were trashed, as they say, by the prosecution, which in some ways got through to the jury and helps explain their loathing of the prosecution and their very quick decision, I think.
We have been speaking with Donald Freed, who, along with Raymond Briggs, is the co-author of Killing Time, the first full investigation, copyright 1996, in hardcover by Macmillan, a book setting forth the evidence and the circumstances surrounding the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, and I think a book which would provoke a great many important questions in the mind of an objective observer. For Donald Freed, this is Dave Emory saying thanks for listening. Hello. Once again, it is my privilege to be joined by Donald Freed, who, along with Raymond Briggs, has co-authored the book Killing Time, the first full investigation, published in hardcover by Macmillan. The book contains a wealth of information people have not heard, in most cases, concerning the O.J. Simpson murder case. Now, of course, the civil trial is on, yea, verily, even as we speak. Don, welcome back to our airwaves.
Thank you.
Now, we were talking about the presentation that you and your co-author, set forth concerning the discrepancies in the case, some of the physical evidence, and I want to get into a very important reenactment that you did with regard to the Bronco in just a minute. We've heard a lot about the blood drops, and we heard a lot about how this was the absolutely incriminating evidence linking O.J. Simpson to the case beyond a shadow of a doubt, and yet you point out that the blood drops themselves not only occur in some very strange places, unaccountable places, but that the actual nature of the blood drops, the shape of the drops on the ground, are not consistent with those with the drops that would be left by a fleeing suspect.
Yes, this matter of blood and DNA, the so-called mountain of evidence, and now, listeners to your program, I want to call on the uttermost of your critical faculties, because we have to deal semantically very carefully. We are told that blood drops traced to Mr. Simpson through the process of DNA testing were found at the scene of the crime. Now, DNA and blood traced to someone is not found at the scene of the crime. What's found at the scene of the crime is evidence, blood evidence. That blood evidence then enters a process. It is collected and enters that process or that chain of evidence. And at a given time, after a passage of time and at different places, that is, so that time and space are involved, an equation emerges of more or less matching a given individual, if it's DNA. But that passage or process involves human beings, laboratories, storage, and all the components of a chain of evidence. So when the defense argued garbage in, garbage out at the trial, and the jury embraced that concept, that was based on events that took place in that chain of evidence. Now, listeners are familiar with the fact that Detective Furman both said and did things which aroused the gravest suspicion. They were also aware of Detective Van Adder, who took a sample of Mr. Simpson's blood and had it under his control. But many of them are not aware that we learned this summer from Gary Sigler, who works for the coroner's office, that same Detective Van Adder had gone to the coroner's office on June 15th, 2 days after the murder, and demanded samples of the victim's blood. And therefore, June 13th and June 16th, Detective Van Adder and perhaps others had under his control samples of all the principals' blood, Mr. Goldman, Miss Simpson, and Mr. Simpson. In that same time period, from June 13th to June 16th, listeners may be stunned to learn that the evidence collected at the crime scenes was not turned in. Whether it was in refrigerators, whether it was in paper bags, whether it was in reference samples, it was not turned into the police lab until the 16th. Therefore, in summary, all of the evidence and samples of all of the principals' blood was out of the chain of evidence, wild, out of control, and in the field between June 13th and June 16th. Now, I say that as a fact. You are now armed with the basic logistics of the blood evidence, and you, I think, should have that in mind when you now ask yourself, is it really possible? Is it probable? Isn't it improbable that all of the blood could have been contaminated? When you ask that question, remember, you're asking, is it more or less improbable that the blood is all contaminated? Is that more or less improbable than the prosecution scenario? What you are not asking is it more or less improbable than a clear, obvious, logical, and stipulated answer? Because no such answer exists, or there wouldn't be this enormous controversy and there wouldn't be this national crisis. So you have to choose between two improbable scenarios. And before you make that final choice, you should look more clearly at the prosecution scenario in terms of the timeline. And when you've done that, then I think you're equipped to make that decision. But I should say this. The suggestion that the jury was too stupid or too black or both to understand the DNA is an infamous suggestion when you realize that Dr. Kary Mullis, the Nobel Prize winner, who invented the test that the state used for the DNA, was prepared to testify and indeed told our researchers, and we quoted in the book, that the test as conducted by the state, his test, was, quotes, worthless, close quotes. So we're talking about the Nobel Prize winner. He took no money, by the way, nor did Dr. Henry Lee, the world's greatest criminologist, employed by the State Police of Connecticut. When he said about the blood evidence, quote, something wrong, close quotes, those words, worthless, something wrong, that means garbage in, garbage out. Dr. Lee took no money. Now, Dr. Terrence Speed from Berkeley, who works with law enforcement often, testified that the prosecution's 1 in 5 billion, 1 in 6 billion, 1 in 50 billion mathematics about the DNA was, in fact, completely wrong, that the figures should be 1 in 200. Now, while it's true that 1 in 200 is also a very high percentage, yet Dr. Speed, who took no money, and I stress this because we've heard that you can buy experts, and we know that you can buy experts. We're talking about world-class experts here. The three big names took no money. They did not know Mr. Simpson. They have nothing to do with sports or Hollywood. In fact, they suffered punishing insults from their professional circles for daring to associate themselves with this case. Now, the jury was most mystified and shocked when Dr. Robin Cotton, speaking for the Cellmark Laboratory, a famous lab, when asked by the defense on cross-examination, what is your reference base for the DNA in African Americans that you've based your 1 in 5 billion figures? The answer was, quote, 2 African Americans in the Detroit area, close quotes. That's 2 African Americans. So when you begin to look more closely and you realize that the great experts in this case were on the defense, that science turned against the prosecution in this case, and though they had no knowledge or friendship with Mr. Simpson, you have to ask yourself why and what was going on, and whether or not the media, by not putting quotes around mountain of evidence and by using it as a given fact, didn't lead the country into this nervous breakdown that followed on October 3rd last year after the verdict by pointing out in the most strident terms that only someone too stupid or too biased would realize that. And this comes from the prosecutors and the prosecution books and the inside books, and these people have toured the country denouncing the jury system in general and African-American jurors in particular, and it has created a national crisis.
You also mentioned that the blood drops themselves do not appear to have been made from or left by a fleeing subject, but rather appear to have been dropped deliberately from a relatively short distance above the ground.
Yes, listeners, try it yourself. Take an eyedropper, fill it with water. These blood drops that were found are without direction. They would have had to come from about 24 inches above the ground from a stationary position. I'm not even mentioning the blood that appears and disappears on socks and Broncos and back gates and so forth. I'm talking about the so-called blood drops to the left of departing footsteps at the murder scene. By the way, that's painted in a way, that word picture, which is far too precise. There are a few blood drops, but remember, and try it yourself, pretend that you have a cut on your left hand and you're bleeding, and walk across the room. Well, you'll find that your left hand moves, and the drop won't always fall next to your left foot, will it?
No, obviously.
And it won't fall in a pristine drop, will it?
No, obviously. Although not so obviously to some of the people who followed the media distortions on the case.
That's right, because they're reading words which say blood drops next to the left foot, which therefore they must come from the left hand. But remember, first of all, they wouldn't be drops. Second of all, they wouldn't be next to the left foot. And third of all, remember, the footsteps reached the back gate, turned around, and returned, according to the state, in order to look for the missing glove and cap that the murderer had lost somehow. But the blood drops don't return and come back. They don't come back. But we are to take it that a murderer comes back, I suppose scratches his head, and looks around, and then shrugs his shoulders, not seeing the glove and hat, and walks away. But let me tell you, we're talking about 2 or 3 feet. We're talking about 36 inches. You have no idea how small the killing space is, where Mr. Goldman lay and where the glove and the hat were, and where they were easily seen by the police. Now, if you were to see that Bundy killing space, you would realize that there is something wrong with the prosecution's scenario about what those footsteps are telling us.
One of the things that you and your co-author did was to engage in a painstaking reenactment of the Bronco pulling up in front of Rockingham. This in connection with Alan Park's testimony, the limousine driver. I wonder if you could briefly, because we have a great many points to get into in about, maybe 18, 17 minutes left in our this half of the discussion. But you and your co-author staged a demonstration, and with some very objective and informed observers. Could you tell us about the demonstration? Who was your control observers, and what did they find?
Yes, and this is the centerpiece of our book. And this is the climax of the timeline, and this is what the defense intends to use as their basic weapon in the civil case upcoming. And this is what the judge has so far refused to allow the jury to go to the Rockingham estate or to the crime scene. And this will create a crisis in the case very shortly. But what the defense intends to prove in the civil case, using, I believe, basically what we did and what anyone could do in our book. The following is this. At about 10:15 or 16, a young limousine driver turned his limo north of Sunset, up Rockingham Drive, and in the silence and the darkness drove slowly looking for the Simpson estate, where he was to take the celebrity to the L.A. airport. This was the first time he had been there, and he was very concerned and even anxious to discharge his duty that night. And at 10:21 about, he arrived at Simpson's home and pulled around to, there are 2 gates, and he pulled around to the second gate, which is about 25 yards from the first gate, at an angle, at a diagonal across the yard. And we know this because he then called his mother, and he called his boss, and he continued to call over the next half hour because he didn't see a light, and he didn't see or hear Mr. Simpson, and he was worried. Now, if you stand at that gate in the darkness with the crickets pulsing, in the silence, 10 on a Sunday murder night, out of that silence a white Bronco will come booming like a brass band, its headlights throwing 100 yards in front of it. No one, not comatose, could miss hearing or seeing Simpson or anyone else arriving at the home. And then we did the test without the motor on and without the lights on, and in a clandestine manner, gliding into place by the gate. You can still hear and see. You are still aware. You are unwittingly providing Mr. Simpson with his alibi. And that's what the jury would see if they're taken up there. Because in a circumstantial murder case, it's not surprising that the alibi will be circumstantial. So it's the honest limousine driver, not what he sees or hears, but what he doesn't see or hear, that tells us that Mr. Simpson's alibi is basically validated, because if you can't enter and you can't leave by vehicle that estate after 10:21, then you are in effect locked in time in that mansion. And that is Simpson's alibi. And though you are only 6 minutes away from the Bundy murder scene, you might as well be in Paris or London. And you might as well ask, well, if he was in Paris or London, how could his blood have been found at the scene? But then you would be asking the question in the proper perspective. Here, on June 12, 1994, while the murders were taking place between 10:32 and 10:42 at the murder scene, based on the ear witnesses, after 10:21, no one can enter or exit the Rockingham estate, because the young limousine driver is there looking and listening in vain for his celebrity charge.
Now, one of the points you also make, before we get to some unexamined evidence, is that one of the things that the prosecution used to attempt to show that O.J. was not there was the fact that the house appeared dark, and yet you and your co-author point out that that house can be fully lit and yet appear dark from the outside.
Well, absolutely. You have only to look at the tape, O.J. Simpson's tape, which we are forbidden to look at because we are told it's for profit and that it's self-serving, unlike every other institution in this utopia in which we live. But it's a historic tape, but self-serving, no more or less than anything else that's produced by human endeavor. But he shows you how the house is ablaze with light, but you can't see it from the gate. And he took his lawyers. He took Greta Van Susteren of CNN. He's taken a number of people to see this. So the young limousine driver was honest, all right, but he wasn't clairvoyant. But he's honest enough. He was never asked, remember, at the criminal trial, did you see or hear Mr. Simpson pull up in his Bronco? But he will be this time, and the answer will be no. And it is this Bronco experiment, I predict, will be to the Simpson affair what the Zapruder film was to the Kennedy assassination. And parenthetically, as David has talked about many times, the Zapruder film was a clock. A 6-second clock, that home movie of President Kennedy's murder, and you could take it apart frame by frame and decide whether one man could fire 4 times.
And indeed, some of the clocks that you and your co-author provide show that O.J. Simpson was framed in this particular case. Don, we've got about 12 minutes. I'm going to attempt to do the impossible once again, as O.J. Simpson was alleged by the prosecution to have done. And I'm going to present a number of bullet points, or again, we're using perhaps a grotesque pawn knife points here, and get brief comments, although I am going to read one short passage from your book, which I think exemplifies the dramatic nature of the information that you and your co-author have dug up, but that has not been reported by the major media. One of the most important aspects of your book concerns unexamined pieces of evidence. I'm going to touch on these, and I'm just going to bring them up, and I want you to comment as briefly and succinctly as possible, and although obviously substantively. A mystery phone call placed at around 10:30 asking whether a double murder at Bundy had been investigated.
Yes, and that's been confirmed in a new book called A Problem of Evidence by Joe Bosco as well. That's a fact, but whether it means everything or nothing, we will never know until there's a new investigation, and that's what we're demanding.
Nicole's garage held some evidence that has not been brought to light.
Yes, it did. There's evidence of people waiting their change found on the floor. There's evidence that that's how the murderers, and there had to be more than one, as we find it, entered through that garage.
Blood under Nicole's fingernails did not match O.J.'s.
That is right. There was blood under her fingernail. There was blood on her back. There was blood on the keys to the car that Mr. Goldman had borrowed, and those keys were returned to the young woman who owned the car without the blood being tested, if you can believe that. There's an inventory. There's fingerprints, 17 pairs that were not traced to anyone at that scene. The list is a long one.
The mystery DNA in the Bronco that has never been tested and that did not match any of the suspects or victims.
That is a fact. There was a trace of mystery DNA in the Bronco. Could that be from someone planting evidence?
A dog, the Akita, that belonged to Nicole, chased or apparently went after something or somebody in a direction the opposite of what the prosecution contends.
That's right, in the opposite direction of the footprints, the shoe prints. But remember, listener, the crime scene was hosed down within 12 hours.
Except for the back gate, of course. we'll get to the back gate a little later. But now, one of the things that is mentioned in a book by about Cato Kalin, and that author Stephen Worth, who will be joining us shortly, brings up in his book Blood Oath, is that O.J. Simpson had been getting threats from neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups, some of those delivered by sympathetic cops or sympathetic to the white supremacists within LAPD. Even the FBI had informed him about this. What I did not know until I read your book, Don, was that Nicole also had been getting both letters and threatening phone calls from neo-Nazi groups concerning not only her interracial relationship with O.J., but her connections with Jewish personages.
That's right, lawyers and friends who were Jewish. There were threats, both physical and telephonic, surrounding, interestingly enough, all the principals in this case over a period of about a year at least. O.J. Simpson's place had been entered the night before the murder, and apparently a strange message left on his answering machine in a foreign language. That is correct.
O.J. Simpson had been cornered. He testified in his deposition before the police from June 13th that 3 cars had cornered him and cut him off. Could you tell us about that?
Well, that is correct. It's a question now of putting together these threats. Where are they coming from? What's the common denominator? Ron Goldman seemed to be working in an extremely dangerous restaurant subculture. What's the common denominator?
A 14-year-old boy who was a neighbor of Nicole's heard screams and saw 3 white men out and back. His parents have since received threatening phone calls, and they're undecided about whether to come forward.
That is true. We've tried our best, and we feel that there are a number of people that would come forward if there were a new investigation, but it would probably take that because the prosecution damaged and insulted everyone who wouldn't fit into their timeline.
In connection with the neo-Nazi threats, Nicole had actually asked O.J. to come around because she was worried, and she felt she was being observed and threatened by someone other than O.J.
That's right. She asked O.J. Simpson, her former husband, and other friends to try to pass by at night when they could because she was concerned.
Ron Goldman had received threats.
He had indeed threats to his life by someone who may have been obsessively jealous of him. Now, this is not, I want to be very careful. I'm not in any way suggesting that Mr. Goldman is to blame for his own death, and when his father attacked me recently on Larry King, I reiterated that only that since we don't know who the killer is, we don't know who the target was. And young Mr. Goldman, even had he been a saint, nevertheless was working in a bistro and disco restaurant subculture where there have been other murders.
Yes, there have also been some deaths of people connected with some of the principals. You mentioned a record producer, Charles Minor, who was connected to O.J.?
Yes, there is a kind of a body count around this case.
Also, a former co-waiter and friend of Ron Goldman's named Michael Nigg.
Yes.
Casimir Butch Casey Susharsky, a reputed organized crime associate of O.J.'s in his Buffalo playing days, was also murdered shortly after the killings.
So along with 2 women, yes, that's 3 in Florida.
A couple of friends of Ron are supposedly, according to your book, are in hiding now for fear of their lives.
Well, 2 have disappeared, 3 were murdered. That's Ron Goldman, Michael Nigg, and Brett Cantor. Cantor was stabbed almost exactly the same way Goldman was. And that Cantor murder was investigated by the same robbery and homicide squad that Lang and Van Adder, the detectives in the Simpson case, with which they were associated with robbery homicide.
In discussing Stephen Singular's book, and we're going to be joined by Stephen Singular shortly here, in discussing Stephen Singular's book, Legacy of Deception, we analyzed the burglary of Jennifer Amelie's office, Amelie. She was a psychotherapist who'd been counseling both Ron and Nicole and had some of her files burglarized. By way of underscoring, Donald, the importance of the information that you and your co-author have developed and how great the variance is with the public perception of the case, I'd like to read some of your actual text from pages 147 and 148.
Right.
Now, this concerns Dr. Jennifer Amellie, again, that psychotherapist who had some files burglarized, but what I did not know until I read your book was that there was a whole lot more going on around her than just burglarized files. Reading now from page 147 of Killing Time, Dr. Jennifer Amellie, A-M-E-L-I, a clinical psychologist who had counseled both Ron and Nicole, was in 1994 and 1995 harassed and threatened, her offices burglarized and case files stolen. A specialist in relationship, marriage, and family counseling, Dr. Amellie also works with drug-related problems and the Tarzana Rehabilitation Center and has a number of her clients in the entertainment field. In March of 1996, she detailed for our interviewer, Ian Boeter, is that the correct pronunciation? This list of intimidations. Early in 1995, an anonymous telephone caller asked to purchase the files of Nicole and Ron. Dr. Amellie refused. A few days later, her office in Santa Monica was broken into and some files were stolen. Police investigating the break-in removed from the scene other files and a bill addressed to Goldman. Concerned with client-therapist confidentiality issues, Dr. Amellie reported this to the Board of Behavioral Sciences of the Consumer Protection Agency. A few weeks later, an unknown assailant approached Dr. Amellie from behind. He pushed and threatened her, telling her to keep her mouth shut about the Simpson case. She did not see his face or recognize his voice, but could only tell that he was tall. During this time, she also received threatening telephone calls. Sometime later, she was confronted near her Malibu home, which houses her second office. Subsequently, someone broke into her house and office. Fearing for herself and her family, Dr. Amellie reported all incidents to the police and asked for protection, but found them unsympathetic. She admits that her answers to police inquiries had to be evasive because she did not want to violate client confidentiality. She believes this may have antagonized the police. I was startled to read about this because I knew about the burglaries. I did not realize about the pattern of intimidation. And again, many of the people, in fact, virtually all the people involved with this case, victims and alleged perpetrator, have received threats, intimidation, and there's obviously a whole lot more to this case than just the official version.
It calls out for a new investigation, letting the computer chips fall where they may. It really does.
We have once again been told that that this crime, which has riveted the national attention, was performed by a lone nut, basically, an out-of-control husband. And yet, who was threatening Jennifer Amellie? Who was following her around? Who threatened Ron Goldman? Who was placing the threats and the surveillance on Nicole and possibly O.J.? There are many, many more questions than answers about this case. I think, however, that the work that you and your co-author have done, Don, have driven a white Bronco, I guess one could say, through the very middle of the official version of this case, one which sadly has been bruited about by the national media, which have taken the prosecution's allegations at virtual face value and not done any serious investigating.
That's right, and have turned around and blamed the jury and blamed the race of the jury and caused a great deal of mischief and trouble. And when the educated class is derelict, and when there's a failure of intellect and of character, such as in this case, then what started out as a minor media melodrama quickly escalates to become an emblematic crisis.
We've been speaking with Donald Freed, who, along with Raymond Briggs, is the co-author of Killing Time, the first full investigation, a very penetrating analysis of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman and the investigation or alleged investigation into those. If listeners' appetites have been whetted from the admittedly truncated discussion of your book that we've been able to fit into the allotted broadcast time here, I strongly recommend that they go out to their local retail book outlet and pick it up or order it. Donald, I want to thank you for appearing on our program, and I want to thank you for your past work.
Thank you. We talk every time there's a need for dialogue, and when the conduits of the air and press which are supposed to belong to the people but do not, then we can be very grateful for programs such as this.
I've been speaking with Donald Freed. For Donald Freed, this is Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.